Okay, today we're going to take a look at events abroad and isolationist policies that are going to be used to try and keep the United States out of World War II. And when we take a look at the events abroad, we have three main countries we're dealing with, which will eventually become the Axis powers. We're looking at Italy, Germany, and Japan. And Italy and Germany are first going to be bound together by what's called fascism. This is going to be created by Benito Mussolini. And this is the idea that the nationalistic policies of a country are more important than the individual's rights. They do embrace capitalism, and what's going to happen is Benito Mussolini is going to seize power in 1922. He literally marches on the government with his black shirts, which are essentially his secret police and thugs, and he plays up heavily anti-communist policies, which communism was becoming really popular because of the economic situation over in Europe. And then later, even when the Depression hits, it becomes even more important as a result of that. But he's going to seize power, like I said, in 1922, and we're going to see that he will begin a conquest of expansion, and he is going to actually attack Ethiopia, the last uncontrolled territory, with the exception of Liberia, found in Africa. In Germany, the fascist organization that's going to form is going to be the National Socialist Party. They're going to form in the early 1920s, and of course, they're better known as the Nazis. Hitler is eventually going to join the party, and because of his charismatic ability, he's going to gain control in the latter 20s. And of course, most of you guys know he's going to use the rhetoric from Mein Kampf, which is his anti Jewish theories, his hatred of the Versailles Treaty and the state that Germany has been left in, and eventually he's going to gain in popularity. He's also going to copy Mussolini with the use of his brown shirts, which essentially will eventually become the SS, or better known as also known as the Gestapo. He is going to seize control of the government in 1933 and give himself dictatorial power at that time. And then, of course, he will begin his expansion in Europe. Now, Japan is a little bit odd. Japan, of course, is under the rule of the Emperor Hirohito. However, Hirohito actually wanted to be a marine biologist, is actually what his specialty was, except, of course, he's also the Emperor of Japan, and he's convinced by his staff, predominantly the army, will come to play a larger role, and we'll see that later. The emergence of Prime Minister Chojo is going to be the main guy driving the force behind the war. And his staff convinces him that the necessity of expansion is what's key to their survival. Again, Japan has very little raw materials and raw resources. And so the goal is to gain those materials that Japan lacks. In doing this, it leads to the invasion of China and a lot of Southeast Asia. Now, what happens is when we start looking at America, again, we are totally isolationist for the most part. And a lot of the rhetoric that's going to come out from this policy is a result of Senator Gerald Nye, pictured here, of North Dakota. He essentially platforms on the idea that entry into World War I was a huge mistake, that the deaths that resulted from the war, our involvement was just a ridiculous monetary gain for pretty much bankers and the arms manufacturing business. And as a result of his platforming, this actually becomes a very big platform that a lot of people will buy into. And again, this will continue to promote a lot of the anti-war policy prior to the United States entry into World War II. It actually spawns three different neutrality acts. We get the Neutrality Act of 1935, which essentially allowed the president to prohibit arms shipments to any country at war, which is essentially called a belligerent nation. And the president could also forbid travel to any belligerent nations of even civilians. So again, really stepping into the ability of keeping the country out of the war and to not have unrestricted submarine warfare like we saw in World War I becoming a big possibility. We also have the 1936 one forbade loans and the extensions of loans to any belligerent nations. So again, if there was a monetary tie-in, This put pressure on these countries not to declare war or not to be aggressive militarily. And finally, we get the 1937 one, forbade the shipping of arms to the opposition side of the Spanish Civil War, which are going to be the fascist forces of General Francisco Franco. Now, in taking a look at this, the Spanish Civil War is going to play a much more important role that's going to lead to World War II than a lot of people realize. It was essentially the royal government, which were known as the Loyalists, fighting against General Francisco Franco, who was a fascist. Now, essentially what happened, since the United States stayed out of this, what happens is Franco appeals to his other fascists. He appeals to Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. And what happens is Hitler and Mussolini use their siding with Franco as a trial run to World War II. So when the war actually breaks out, the Germans and the Italians actually have experienced airplane fighters as well as tank strategy figured out already, because they've already been battling in this war. Franco ends up winning the war, and Spain ends up remaining neutral during World War II. And Franco's dictatorship, guys, actually lasts until his death in 1972. Now, probably the biggest thing is when the war does break out, we start to see FDR's policies really slowly begin to change, where he goes from anti-war to pro-British. As a result of that, we end up having the formation of the America's First Committee. And this group forms, and they actually have lots of speakers speaking out against fighting and war. In fact, Charles Lindbergh is one of their largest supporters and actually goes on tour throughout the United States. You can see here, this is a propaganda poster that was actually created by the America's First Committee. And again, they were relatively successful. The isolationist ideals and policies were very strong, and most of America did not want to get involved in any type of foreign war at that time.